and I'm really proud to deliver it.
Well done.
I call the Honourable Member Philip Twyford.
Talofa lava, lau awhionga, Mr Speaker.
Tolofa.
E mua ona au whaali atu, o le vaiaso taua lenei. O le vaiaso e whaataua ai le ngangana Samoa. O le ngangana Samoa, ua ngangana e le toatele I tuatonu o Aukulani. O te whaatalofa atu I lau puleanga I te atatu. Ma tangata Samoa, uma I Nuusila. O le ngangana Samoa, o se aoro e whaataua, aua le whaalele atili mo tupulanga, I tausanga I luma. E tatau I le malo, ona pasia ni tulafono, e mawhai ai ona, whaamalosia ne whaamoimoi. Whaamanuia mai le atua I le palemene atoa. Whawhatai lava lau awhionga, Mr Speaker.
Malo.
Soifua.
Whawhatai lava.
Mr Speaker, it is Samoan Language Week, and Samoan is the third most spoken language in our nation, and it is, I believe, a treasure that we should nurture and safeguard for future generations. Mr Speaker, I'm going to talk about housing in this budget debate. David Parker this afternoon made a comment that I thought was a typically shrewd observation. He said that the announcements that the government made around housing in the budget were typical John Key. Big enough to get a headline, but not big enough to make any impact on the problem. Not big enough to make a difference. And I think it's absolutely plain for anybody in New Zealand today that we have a housing crisis, particularly in certain centres like Auckland, Christchurch, the Bay of Plenty, Queenstown, Nelson. The housing affordability is at its worst, but we also have a housing stock as a nation that is so inadequate, so substandard, that it is causing too many of our children, sir, to die preventable deaths from rheumatic fever, from asthma, from meningococcal disease. The housing market has failed. It is in a terrible state. And the consequence of that is that we've seen plummeting rates of home ownership. We used to have, only a couple of decades ago, one of the highest rates of home ownership in this country that we were proud of as a nation. And home ownership is dropping rapidly, and it's fallen from 75% across the country down to 65% only in the last decade. And for people under 40, it's dropped down to in the high 30s. There are all sorts of consequences. It's not just home ownership and the fact that a whole generation of New Zealanders today are locked out of the housing market. The dysfunction in the housing market has terrible knock-on effects for people all the way down the chain. So people who 2 decades ago would reasonably have expected to be owning their own homes are now renting. People who were renters have now been pushed to the bottom of the market, sir, and are often living in substandard private rental accommodation. There is such an inadequate number of Housing New Zealand and social housing units available that people who would normally have expected to get a state house are now living often are homeless and are living in sleep-outs, in skyline garages, and I see it every day in West Auckland, sir, and in caravan parks. And it is no exaggeration to say that this is a housing crisis for our nation. Now, the government made 2 big announcements in the budget, sir, and one of them was around the reform of social housing. Only the National Party would spend weeks talking up the fact that their budget was going to put people into affordable housing, and then announce that one of the centrepieces of their budget announcement was to boot out 3,000 State House tenants. In the worst housing affordability crisis in living memory. In living memory, it has never been, the housing shortage and the housing affordability crisis has never been this bad, Mr. Speaker, and yet National's great policy centrepiece in this budget is to boot out 3,000 State House tenants. Only the National Party. Mr. Smith, Honourable Nick Smith, the Minister of Housing, announced the transfer of the income-related rental subsidy currently used by Housing New Zealand, announced that's going to be transferred across to the community housing sector, along with his plan to transfer a substantial number of state houses to community housing non-government organisations. On the face of it, probably not a bad idea. But, sir, in the context of the worst housing crisis in living memory, in the context of terrible shortages, what this government is doing, transferring the subsidy across to the community housing sector, introducing reviewable tenancies that will create tremendous insecurity among State House tenants. The National Party is doing everything but the obvious thing, and that is to build more state houses. Now, I know the National Party don't like Housing New Zealand. They've never liked it. They and their predecessors haven't been comfortable with the idea of state-provided social housing since the days of Richard Seddon, let alone through the 30s and 40s and 50s. And in the 90s, the national government sold off 13,000 state houses. Well, they're at it again, sir. They're at it again. They are running down Housing New Zealand. They are transferring its assets and many of its functions and powers away from the organisation. Nick Smith simply wants Housing New Zealand to be another tenancy manager competing with the community housing sector to provide this service. National are up to their old tricks. They are offloading what is a fundamental responsibility of the state, and that is to provide quality, income-related social housing rentals for people, some of the most vulnerable people in our society. And all they are doing is shuffling the deck chairs around on the Titanic, sir. They are doing everything but the obvious thing, and that is to build more social housing. The second big budget announcement that John Key made in the budget was the so-called Housing Accord, and legislation, sir, that would provide a legal framework for the Housing Accord the government has negotiated with Auckland Council, and a framework that would allow the government to do this with councils all around the country. And it is, on the face of it, an attempt to tackle the extreme housing unaffordability problems that Auckland faces. But the problem, sir, as was made absolutely clear in question time today when David Shearer was questioning the Prime Minister, this government has no way of guaranteeing that a single affordable house will be built as a result of its policy. They have nothing to say. The Prime Minister was completely unable to give the House any kind of explanation or reassurance that any affordable houses will be built as a result of their policy. All the so-called Accord does, Mr. Speaker, is cherry-pick a couple of aspects of the Auckland Unitary Plan. That is, it brings in a supply of greenfields land into the land supply more quickly than it otherwise would have done, and it fast-tracks the RMA consenting for affordable housing. Two of a whole long list of things that are at the root of the housing affordability crisis. The government wants us to believe that tinkering with the RMA will solve the crisis. Well, it won't. It just won't cut the mustard. And it's very clear that just bringing in some more greenfields land into the system will likely result in the construction of more houses that will sell for $750,000 on the fringes of the city. That is not what's needed. It won't put a single Kiwi family into affordable homes. The one thing they need to do, that the government needs to do, is pick up a hammer and build some affordable housing. We have a shortage. There is a supply crisis. There are not enough affordable homes. The industry has seized up and it is not building affordable homes because for the builders and the developers, there's no margin in it for them. What the government needs to do is roll up its sleeves and build affordable housing, as the Labour Party will do in government from the end of next year with our Kiwi Build policy, Mr. Speaker. We will build 10,000 modern, affordable starter homes every year for a decade. And while we're doing that, we will drive down the costs. We will use the scale of Kiwi Build to drive productivity improvements, to do deals with suppliers, to reform the building and construction industry, to drive down the costs of the construction of new homes, sir, and to provide a lasting solution. This government, in its housing announcements, basically created a charade. Nick Smith's job as Minister of Housing has been to convey a sense of activity that he's doing something. But the government is doing everything but what they need to do, and that's pick up a hammer and actually build some affordable houses. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Whawhatai lava.
Mr Speaker.
I call the Honourable Joe Goodhue.
Te lofa lava, Mr Speaker.
Mai
To
oi.
the House as well.